Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here as usual, and I am joined today by Howard Lurie, who is the principal analyst in online and continuing education for the Eduventures firm. And Howard, we're very happy to have you on Trending in Education.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to be here.
Yeah, and what provoked this appearance is your recent article in Ancora, which I saw you shared on LinkedIn, which I thought was a really interesting perspective based on some research that you and the team at Eduventures had done recently about adult learners pre and post pandemic, and how there's some interesting data, some interesting trends in there, and I think that's going to be the main thrust of our conversation today. As we set up for that, though, typically I like to ask my guests for a bit of their origin story, what got them into education, what got them to the job that they're in today. I'd love to get a little bit of your backstory for our listeners.
Well, at the dawn of time, I started out as a history teacher, middle school, high school, college, community college, back before the internet kind of took over.
Mm-hmm.
And then got involved in a number of different projects using digital media, using the internet to advance teaching humanities.
Yeah.
Nonprofits, ended up some startups. I did a stint at edX when it got off the ground, Acrobatic, a Carnegie Mellon spinout, and then joined Eduventures about 5 years ago. But I've been tracking sort of the intersection of teaching, digital resources, adults for about 20 years or so.
Right.
At my heart, though, I still think I'm about teaching and learning, trying to understand how people make connections with the people who are trying to teach them, make connections to the content they're trying to learn about, make connections to the world outside their Zoom or classroom or whatever it might be.
Yeah, exactly. And it is the year of the webinar, the year of the Zoom backdrop, the year of lots of things. And as someone who's been an analyst looking at where higher ed in particular is heading and where the activity around higher education and the capital and perspectives on marketplace are evolving, what's 2020 been like for you?
Full of surprises, to say the least. I mean, we published in February, right before the pandemic really took root, our annual analysis of prospective adult learner behavior. Eduventures has been doing, basically for the last 10 years, every other year, a national survey of prospective adults. We're trying to understand what are the triggers that drive them to enrollment at different levels, why some might want to pursue graduate degrees, MBAs, everything down to certificates, courses, and everything in between. And one of the things we had noticed in prior years, this research has gone on, as I said, for quite a long time, is that it seemed that the greater the accumulation of prior educational success and other degrees, credentials, the more likely those learners would try and add more. And the inverse seemed to be true. Those folks who had not had prior success, did not have prior credentials, had the greatest level of sort of tentativeness and lack of sense of could they go forward, which we thought was important and somewhat backwards in the sense of trying to build access and equity for population. We always think about the some college, no degree population, which numbers Strata and Lumina estimate around 40 million. We also thought that had important implications for schools who are trying to recruit prospective adult learners. And so February hit, we published this research, and right away we knew that we needed to then go back to the field and listen carefully to the prospective adult learners and trying to understand how the pandemic and the subsequent recession was impacting their decision making.
Right.
So part of our operating assumption has been, in other periods of economic downturn, adult enrollment tends to be counter-cyclical. So as people lose jobs, they flight back to quality to try and re-credential, upskill, reskill. And we were wondering...
We saw that in 2008, right? That was...
To some degree, yeah. And certainly in dot-com era, when the dot-com boom bust happened, we were wondering, would that happen again to the same level, given the kind of universal impact that the pandemic has had? And so with that in mind, we teed up a new survey we fielded in June, nationally representative survey, to compare and benchmark what we could learn now with what we learned from last year. And then we're
Right.
going to repeat that process in the fall, because we think we're in the third or fourth inning of maybe a 9 or
Yeah.
10 inning game.
Yeah, and
Not
it
to
seems
say,
baseball may be coming back too on a related note. So
right,
baseball analogies are welcome. Yes, yes.
right. So that's what we've done, and that's what 2020 I think has been. I think for us, our hearts are with these learners, these students who are
Mhm.
juggling,
Yeah.
um, the illness in their family,
Hmm.
their friends, their kids,
Hmm.
their adult learners who are furloughed, who
Right.
are trying to anticipate what is my path
Hmm.
forward. So I guess uncertainty has reigned.
Yeah.
And with uncertainty, we're trying to focus on how this population makes decisions and what
Yeah.
we can do, what schools can do to support them going forward.
Yeah, yeah. I feel similarly in, doing a weekly trend spotting show about education in 2020. There's plenty to chew on, and then just the fact that this impacted the entirety of your addressable market at the same time. Like everyone is being forced into these different behavior patterns. And it was interesting in the article, you did distinguish between the short term perspective and a longer term perspective. It does seem like in some ways that the market is somewhat in shock. Like we're all still trying to come to terms with what the new normal is, and then we're still not clear what it will be come the fall. So it
Right.
does feel like there's a critical period we're in now where we're all trying to understand what the fall may be like, and then there'll be the opportunity to reassess and evaluate after the fall.
Right.
And you did do some research, I think, into those two different perspectives. What do people expect for the next 3 months versus a longer time horizon? Any thoughts there?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things we were interested in was attitudes towards wholly or largely online
Hmm.
instruction. So, as some background, what we've seen in the last several years of doing this research is that among prospective adult learners, there's generally around 20%, only 20%, who would say, I'll get my next credential wholly online.
Hmm.
These tend to be the younger adult learners, sort of
Hmm.
28 and lower,
Yep.
tend to be going for master's degrees. They tend to be fully employed.
Hmm.
They tend to have a requisite level of sort of technical savvy.
Hmm.
And so we were keeping our eye on that percentage. And so what we did in the survey was to basically ask them, thinking back, and our surveys are fairly complex, I
Hmm.
should say, that when we survey prospective adult learners, it's a in-depth analysis. It's not through the phone. It's a web-enabled, a smartphone-enabled platform. So we asked them to think back to the time before COVID. What would have been their attitudes about online or wholly online or largely online?
Hmm.
What would be their attitude sort of 3 months out,
Right.
several months out? And then what would be their attitude further out, six
Hmm.
months
Hmm.
out?
Hmm.
As I said, what we've seen in the past is that for almost 70% of prospective adult learners, online was sort of the modality of last resort.
Hmm.
They could tolerate it, but they were, there's significant concern over, will the stuff work?
Right.
What do I do when I need help?
Hmm.
The image of online learning tends to be sort of a serene evening, a like blue glow coming from the screen, a very contented worker, someone studying. They look happy, they look
Yeah.
uninterrupted, and we know that
Yeah.
it's anything but the opposite. They're
Right.
in
Right.
some
Right.
unair conditioned basement, kids are
Right.
crying, the
Right.
thing's not working, the
Right.
machine's rebooting. So that was our thinking. So what we found was that yes, the 20% was there for the folks thinking back before COVID, before
Hmm.
COVID-19.
Hmm.
But when we asked them for that period of time, sort of several months out, the rate of tolerance, the rate of willingness to learn online doubled.
Hmm.
And that was interesting and significant. And we cut
Hmm.
that across many different demographic
Hmm.
factors, prior credentials, and so forth. And then when we looked 6 months out, the rate of attitudes or acceptance of wholly online or largely online, we combine those two, where it's
Hmm.
entirely online or predominantly online,
Hmm.
only dropped to about 30%.
Yep.
So in effect, what we're seeing is short term, many of these prospective adult learners, sort of a quotient of attitudes for online would increase, but not falling back to the pre-pandemic levels before. And the other notable trend we saw was the real decrease was returning to campus full time.
Right.
So in a separate part of the survey, we asked them, what are you most worried about? And among the people who said they are worried, I think a third of that group said, what I'm worried about is being back in public spaces. I'm worried about my own infection. We infer
Right.
from that taking care of kids or elderly people in their family.
Right.
So all that combined, I think it's a signal to schools that, and not surprisingly, schools who had already amassed some experience, some street cred, and also capabilities in running effective online programs have done well in terms of enrollment in this first phase.
Yeah.
Schools that have been less on that development curve, are struggling and will struggle.
Right.
But I think it always comes back to what should schools do to communicate how they will support these learners, whether it's wholly online or largely online. And for those folks who are going to have to come back to campus for some kind of, for example, there are clinical requirements for any nursing or healthcare degree. What is that going to be like to achieve your required hours for education certifications or endorsements? So all of that is part of the mix. That was one thing that we saw early on that we thought was interesting and notable.
Yeah. And then another trend that was in there was, and I think you mentioned it briefly earlier, is increased interest in undergraduate and certificate degrees. And then I thought I saw maybe a decrease in interest in some of the full-on graduate level degrees.
Right. It's a little complex. I mean, and I think that speaks to the fact that these prospective adult learners are complex. There's many countervailing principles they have to focus compared to traditional first-time 18-year-olds who are now struggling with what do I do about going back to school.
Yeah.
The adults are always dealing with competing claims. They've always focused on affordability and flexibility as the drivers for them. So what we've seen now in the last couple of years is an increase of interest in sort of non-degree, short-form certificates, transactional, employability focused, very clear articulation between the programs and the required hiring prerequisites.
Yep.
To some degree, that reflects some of the competitive market. You have other providers, whether they're MOOCs or LinkedIn or Lynda or
boot camps, right?
Exactly. Are now offering sort of very transactional. So in this context of the pandemic, what we've seen is an endorsement, sort of an affirmation that is attractive for a certain segment of prospective adult learners. We also saw interest at the same level we've seen before, a slight uptick of interest in undergraduate degrees, two and 4 year degrees, which some of that could be degree completion. So in effect, people are saying, okay, I've lost my job, I'm furloughed. I will probably have to use some savings or whatever public, whether it's federal or state aid might be available to me. My employer is not going to cover these costs because they're cutting back. So what's my horizon for investment to upskill or reskill? And so it's skewing towards undergraduate degrees and non-degree alternatives. In terms of the graduate degrees, we still see interest. We still see demand there. But in effect, what we've seen is people or this population is pushing that decision out further.
Yes.
So in effect, a greater willingness to enroll in a short term, I'd say 3 months to a year, uptick in non-credit certificate alternatives and undergraduate degrees, and sort of a delay for a year or two among the people who are saying, look, if I'm going back to get the MBA or the terminal degree or some graduate higher cost, more time intensive, that might yield a greater economic result, I'm going to wait because there are too many uncertainties. And I think that speaks to, it's not a nullification of graduate degree demand, but it's more of a logical, intentional sequencing. People saying, I may need to get something shorter, sooner, cheaper than that MBA.
Mm-hmm.
or whatever that graduate degree might be.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
going forward, we're going to keep an eye on that, because since we fielded the survey, which was mid-June, early mid-June,
Yeah.
we've now seen this resurgence
Mm-hmm.
of, the pandemic and the rate of infection and the
Mm-hmm.
rates of death, even though they're largely older folks, it's not receded, it's
Yeah.
increased. And so
Right.
how is that going to affect these decisions is what we'll look at in the next part of this survey.
Yeah. What I found interesting and I really appreciate is the full breadth of your perspective at identifying the adult learner. Frequently, the focus is very much on 18-year-olds who are about to
Right.
enter their undergraduate experience, and obviously those narratives are out there. They're challenging. I've heard tell of the Corona gap year as a new trend, which is
Right.
if you were to ever take a gap year, this might be the one. Any thoughts on the perspective, how we could broaden that perspective in terms of understanding adult learners? Any ways in which maybe we're not thinking about the size of the market? You mentioned the some college no degree percentage was striking when I was digging in that space. So any ways in which our audience might be edified by broadening their perspective based on your experience?
Well, the market's massive.
Mm-hmm.
The demand is massive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have in our survey and others, Strata has done some excellent research, Lumina.
Mm-hmm.
So if you segment just by people who just have a high school diploma
Mm-hmm.
and and are looking for some type of vocationally focused training certificate,
Yeah.
that's an enormous market. I mean, I
Right.
think in
Right.
general, graduate level higher education has done well by focusing on the highest likelihood population, a population with the highest likelihood to enroll in longer, more expensive graduate level degrees.
Right.
And that's been a reoccurring trope. I
Right.
think that what the pandemic has exposed is that you have large segments of the population who have significant demand
Mm-hmm.
and significant need for something other than that graduate degree.
Right.
So is it fall in the category of undergraduate degrees? Well, what are those for an older adult who might have, we have to look back, we have to look at this moment in the context of the last, I'd say prior 10 years where the economy has hummed along,
Yep.
not completely well, but has increased. And so you've had people who may have come out of college or may have come out of high school or may have come out of with an associate degree who said, I'm going to hang on and stay in my job for a
Yep.
period of time
Right.
because I'm getting by as well as I might be able to.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the conditions we're in expose the fact that that's a very tenuous existence.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
the other thing we've thought a lot about and when we do our surveys, we're trying to extract this meaning is that, for a 28-year-old young adult or a 35-year-old young adult, you have to ask yourself, and I think schools need to do this more intentionally, what were they doing 10 years ago in the Great Recession?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what were they doing? What was the imprint of them from 9/11,
Mm-hmm.
20 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
And so I call this sort of a generation exhausted. These are folks who
Mm-hmm.
have experienced significant disruptions in
Yep.
normal life
Right.
periodically.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's as young children experiencing 9/11 and going through that crisis,
Mm-hmm.
the wars, and then the recession. And
Mm-hmm.
so here we are again. And I think
Right.
the way I always think that what our research is trying to do is to shed light on how they make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think in that, the delta between someone deciding to pursue something or not,
Mm-hmm.
the delta there is where schools, I think, can step in and provide not just in name flexibility, but freezes on tuition or fee rates for a
Right.
period of time, the
Mm-hmm.
ability to stop and start a program, leave that program, come back,
Mm-hmm.
favorable requirements on transfer guidelines. These are
Yep.
all, by the way, features that when we ask prospective adult learners what do they want, they all rank those very high and very specific in terms of what they're looking for, not
Mm-hmm.
just career services, but we have them, for example, one of the items we see increased in the last pandemic influenced data is this population looking for greater guidance on debt management.
Mm-hmm.
on accessing career services,
Mm-hmm.
which we hadn't seen that before. It was sort of a hands-off, I think I've got this attitude. Debt was, everyone was assuming massive amounts of debt at
Yeah.
low prices.
Right.
Now I think we see them being more tentative about
Mm-hmm.
how to manage that going forward.
Yeah, yeah. It kind of reminds me of agile software development versus waterfall, where, if you're planning a 2 or 3 year massive project, that's the traditional waterfall model. It's not as resilient to the variability of demand and response once you're out there testing things, which is why it does feel like the market may be pulling back and being a little more flexible in their short-term thinking, because we just don't know what's going on. Like there's so much yet to be determined. Do you have any perspective for folks on the administration side of universities, or folks who are trying to lead higher
Sure.
ed organizations through this crazy time of ours?
Well, one of our through lines that we've always talked about is prior to this, going back in our research the last several years, is many schools of continuing education, extension schools, professional studies, they do this really well.
Mm-hmm.
But the complexity of the adult market is greater. The variables, the inputs that drive people to make decisions to go or not to go, part-time, full-time,
Mm-hmm.
coding boot camp software versus data analytics, MBAs, is much broader and greater
Mm-hmm.
than the drivers of traditional enrollment. There you have sort of a captive population for
Mm-hmm.
all intents and purposes,
Yep.
by age, not everyone, but largely that's where it goes. And then you have an experience that's fairly predictable. Here,
Mm-hmm.
you have a broader range of inputs that are impacting this population. And what they tend to do is focus on sort of very pragmatic ROI calculations. Mm-hmm. What is my pathway to a greater financial security for me and my family?
Right.
And I'm going to pursue that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things we've talked with a lot of schools about, and the work and Eduventures is, we're a research advising firm, we're an independent research advising firm that helps schools make these calculations, is to listen carefully to these learners,
Mm-hmm.
listen carefully to the distinctions between them, and that this type of moment, it's not a matter of jettisoning your graduate programs, but it's a matter of tuning what you offer to that population based on what they're asking for. Mm-hmm. And if they're asking for something that's a sub-degree certificate in a healthcare field that is going to boom and to provide greater job security going forward, then that's an intelligent decision. If it's saying, well, we're really good at offering online MBAs and that's what we're going to offer, that good luck. I think that could be a challenge, given right. that might take a longer period of time. Mm-hmm. I think that the other thing that we've surfaced is that, and part of our surveys, by the way, use an analysis that asks prospective learners to identify their expectations. Why are they doing this? The ways in which they would prefer to learn, sort of their desired experiences, and then what we call features, literally what they're willing to pay for. And then we're able to segment that by prior credential, by demographics, and also we apply what we call a mindset filter. So we've identified 4 typical mindsets of that can reveal how people make decisions. I think that level of complexity is really hard and necessary, but can be expensive for graduate schools, professional studies schools, to make those, to offer that type of differentiation.
Yeah.
But I think it's ultimately, I think, schools that have done well in doing this have done that, have recognized that complexity. Right. And I would put schools like UCLA Extension, obviously Southern New Hampshire, University of College, UMUC, now called Global Campus.
Right.
Some of the for-profits have done well with this, Capella and Strayer. They've listened carefully to what those adult prospects are actually asking for, and then trying to be responsive, a heightened level of responsiveness. Now, again, the challenge now is this all counter-cyclical? Because when people lose their jobs, they tend to go back, and our answer to that question has been, for some, yes, it will be, who have amassed capital, have a storehouse. but
Right.
not for all.
Right.
Given the unpredictability of things like childcare,
Yep.
commuting, transportation,
Right.
online,
Right.
we're not it may happen, but it may not happen in the speed and the arc of the enrollment chart that we've seen before.
Right. So it does sound like some of this is net beneficial to the Coursera's and the LinkedIn Learning. You know, the fact that folks may not want to go full on, at least in the short term. Really short term is what I'm talking about, but I imagine longer term there'll probably be some further benefit once folks adopt, that people will look for a targeted light commitment but hard skill development for themselves to make them more employable, and then play a little more of a wait and see game around where are we actually going to be come October, November, December. And by then it is sort of that corona gap year idea where the
Right.
traditional academic calendar that begins in the fall and runs through May of the following calendar year, that's kind of shot to hell in some ways. So I think people are going to be reevaluating what options are. Either they're committed to this cycle, or they're playing a little more of a wait and see. And there's potentially more interest in, while you're waiting and seeing, can you accrue skills? Can you accrue value by being a little more short-term transactional about your educational experience?
But I think that's a good point, Mike. But I think it extends even further. I mean, I think that for the some college no degree, the high school diploma, prospective learner looking for that transactional course or certificate, institutions of higher education may only be one of the items on their list. They might be looking at credentials provided entirely by the private sector, by the corporate world. So Amazon had already, prior to this, made a considerable investment in its training frontline workers. Walmart, we see doing that. Google, of course, they're looking at computer software coding and the like.
Right.
But I think that from the point of view of the consumer, sure, there is always faith in higher education, but can it deliver in the speed and time and cost and price point that that particular learner can afford in terms of investment? And if instead it can be done by something that's not accredited the same way, then they're probably going to go in that direction. That's an attractive alternative. In terms of MOOCs, they have all, Coursera and edX and Udemy, they've all seen significant increases in enrollment from across different metropolitan areas, national, regional areas, and so forth, across disciplines. Those are still just branded content from universities and institutions. And they're great. And I think everyone has sort of dabbled and taken those courses. And they do have an opportunity to really fill a very, very significant gap. And I think they've made very good progress in terms of pivoting and creating that flexibility. The question still in the mind of the prospective adult learner is, will this thing that I'm taking online by myself, self-paced, one of 20,000 people in a course on data analytics, will this help me reskill and insulate myself from the next period of time?
Right.
And that's, I think, still unknown. I think that's still a question that is still in process of being answered. So I think it's an opportunity for those providers to demonstrate viability and throughput. But I think there's still skepticism. So our data, for example, we ask our prospective adult learners, would you look at an alternative boot camp or a MOOC? And the percentages in the context of, I want to go for a career and technical education degree or an undergraduate degree and an associate degree, it's around 10 or 12%. Because I will do something other than those degrees or institutions. So we haven't seen that uptick yet. We're looking to see whether folks would say, yes, I will now go entirely online with edX or Coursera, but we have not yet seen it. And also related to that, we asked them about how would you pay? And so things like income sharing agreements, which have garnered a lot of attention, and I think they're very interesting. There's been investment in them. You know, our prospective adult pool, still it's around 8 or 9% said, I'm going to pursue that. Hasn't maybe ticked up a couple of percentage points, which is probably not statistically significant year to year, but it's not been an overwhelmingly march towards that. And By and large, it's federal or private loans, federal loans,
Mm-hmm.
savings. What we do notice is more highly employed graduate-seeking prospects are counting on some employer contributions.
Yep.
And they're banking on that. Those still be there.
Mm.
That's part of what the game is that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's fascinating because a lot of the conversations we've had on the workforce side has been that these learning benefits are in fact a benefit that is used to attract talent and
Sure.
retain and develop the talent. But now with the rapid transformation of business models that's happening, not every organization can afford just to keep people employed. They're furloughing folks and or laying them off. And then it's a question of, do you want to spend on an educational benefit? And if so,
Right.
who qualifies for it and what's the return on that? It all does point, from my perspective, it all does point to developing more affordable online solutions that are flexible and just in time developed is the other component. Because I think a lot of the skepticism you're describing is in part because we don't know what we don't know. Like, how will jobs change in the next few years? How much of that will be driven purely by the COVID response, and how much of it is being driven by the fourth industrial revolution and other trends that were already happening around machine learning and automation? How does that dovetail with this pandemic? And then what does the job market look like, say, 2 to 5 years out? I think a lot of us really just don't know, which is why the skepticism to me makes a lot of sense. I know we're getting close to time. This has been fantastic getting a little opportunity for you to impart your knowledge on me and our listeners. If folks want to learn more about this type of stuff, where should they go?
So eduventures.com.
Okay.
We are, as I said before, we're Eduventures Research. We're provide a variety of different research and advising services on traditional learners, technology, student success, obviously the adult learner market, but eduventures.com. Every Tuesday we offer what's called a wake-up call. It's a free 1,000 words from myself or one of our analyst team members about current trends in education. So we run national surveys. We're releasing this week a survey of chief online learning officers. It's called Chloe. It's been the 5th survey in that series. So eduventures.com, look for the wake-up calls. Happy to answer any questions going forward.
Yeah, thank you. There's a little more for our listeners, so don't hang up, because typically the last question we like to ask
go ahead.
Is what other trends outside of everything we talked about so far are capturing your attention? What's something surprising, something counterintuitive, a little surprising morsel of insight from Howard Lurie on his way out the door?
Well, I think there's a stirring that's spawned by the pandemic, and then the turmoil that's been surfaced through questions about race and equity, racial injustice. I think that schools are, in general, attempting to listen carefully to these issues. I think they cut across all sorts of demographics. But I think one of the messages that's coming through is that higher education institutions, I wouldn't say it's an existential threat for them, but they need to demonstrate their viability and credibility from the graduate PhD levels all the way down that spectrum to servicing a working class single parent with a high school diploma. And what can they do for them, whether they're public institutions or private or whatever that dimension might be. And I think they're having to, in fact, I think it's an industry sector-wide wake-up call to say, let's listen to what people need. What kind of support do they need? What is the sort of economic consideration they're willing to provide, because this is in effect a product? And what can we do to educate more people equitably, efficiently? And I think that's the inflection point we're at. And so, yes, all of the other issues that we're talking about, I think, feed into that. But look, in the United States, education, higher education is playing an essential role. It has to still play that role. It has to seize that mantle and move forward with that and not retreat. And I think sometimes it puts schools, sort of maybe more established systems in schools, in awkward positions to say, gee, I need to rethink what our structures are. Now's the time to do it.
Yeah.
Because it's a critical period, and I think many schools will step up and do that. And I hope that we can help in that process.
Awesome. Howard Lurie, morsels of wisdom imparted in multiple directions. Check out the Wake Up Call. Check out Eduventures. Howard, also a great follow on LinkedIn. Thanks very much for joining.
Thanks, Mike. Take care.
And for our listeners, we'll be back again soon. Thanks as always for listening.